Hello again. Because their present prospects are, whether because of systemic racism or other reasons, not perhaps as bright as those of most white people in the West, many people of African heritage boast of the wonders and glories of Africa before the arrival of white Europeans in that continent. We hear of the marvellous empire of Mali, whose ruler in the early 14th century, Mansa Musa, was rumoured to be the richest man who has ever lived. I shall deal in another video today about this obsession with the past rather than the present or future, which seems to me damaging psychologically. But for now, let us simply look at the claims made about this golden age of African civilization to which many black people hark back, the days when they were kings. I'm going to take literally all that is said about Mali and the fabled wealth of Mansa Musa, although some of the stories are pretty dubious. Let us, though, for the sake of argument, assume that the legends which African Americans and Caribbeans in Britain tell are all true, and that there was indeed a fantastically rich and sophisticated black African empire in Central Africa a century or two before white people began exploring Africa. How did such a kingdom or empire become so rich? Where did its money come from? This is a sort of awkward question which nobody ever apparently wants to ask. We hear that Mansa Musa was so wealthy and had so much gold that when he visited Cairo, he wrecked the Egyptian economy by bringing so much gold with him and scattering it about. This too is something which enthusiasts of black history mention a lot when talking about the glorious days of the past when there were kings. Where did all this money actually come from, and how did Mansa Musa get his hands on it? The answer is devastatingly simple, but not one which will prove very palatable to the average person of African ancestry. There is currently an effort to have the entire British Empire branded as a racist enterprise, on the grounds that it was ultimately based upon the transatlantic slave trade and that this awful business was bound up with the early origins of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of Britain as a world power. It is suggested that the wealth generated by the trade in slaves has contaminated every aspect of the empire. Let us look at Mali and another African kingdom nearby called Canaan, which is also promoted by militant black activists as grand examples of what Africans could achieve before white people showed up. We know about these empires or kingdoms chiefly through the writings of Arabs and Berbers who travelled across the Sahara in the 14th century to visit them. Let's see what such people had to say about the wealth of Mali and Canaan. In 1351, a Berber scholar and explorer from Tangier set off across the Sahara from the Mediterranean coast of Morocco. Ibn Batoutah had already travelled extensively in Asia and the Middle East, and now he wished to see what lay south of his own homeland in the largely uncharted country of West Africa. After crossing the Sahara in a camel caravan, Ibn Batoutah arrived at Taghaza. This is now in the north of the modern-day country of Mali. Slabs of rock salt were mined here at the time that Ibn Batoutah visited the town, and heavy work was undertaken by slaves from the Masufa tribe. The export of salt was one major source of Mali's wealth. After spending some time in Taghaza, the caravan moved south again, eventually reaching the capital of the Empire of Mali, which lay on the banks of the river Niger. This was a Muslim realm ruled by a black African sultan. Slaves were so common that Ibn Batoutah was even given one as a present. After looking at other districts of West Africa, Ibn Batoutah returned to Morocco, travelling with a caravan which was transporting 600 female slaves north across the Sahara. To the east of Mali lay another black realm, which was so extensive at one time that it might not inaptly be called an empire. This was known as Canaan, and our information about it comes chiefly from Arab geographers. In the 7th century, a leader of the Arab armies which had conquered North Africa established a base in the middle of dense forest, which at that time covered part of the Tunisian coast. This grew into a city called Kairouan. Mosques and a university were founded, and the city traded with a power which had grown up in Central Africa, not far from Lake Chad. Some of the nomadic tribes which roamed the savannah south of the Sahara Desert had banded together and put down roots, building walled towns. By the 9th century AD, Canaan was one end of a busy route running south from Kairouan and ending in their own territory. Al-Yaqubi, a geographer writing at that time, said that I have been informed that the kings of the blacks sell their own people without justification or in consequence of war. Canaan's prosperity was based upon exporting goods north to the Arab world of North Africa. Camel caravans travelled across the desert carrying two principal cargoes. One was salt. There were mines where this was dug out by slave labour. That was how all the salt mining was done in Africa at that time. The other thing which was sold to the Arabs was people. Those who ran Canaan used to make regular raids into areas where the Bantu tribesmen were less well organised and then take them as prisoners to be sold to Arab merchants. In the early years of Canaan, about 1,000 slaves a year were sold in this way, but by the 15th century this had increased to 5,000 a year. Both the internal economy of Canaan and its external mercantile activities were based upon slavery. Slaves worked the salt mines and also undertook much of the heavy and unpleasant physical labour in cities and farms. The centre of political power in Canaan shifted over the years, and by the middle of the 16th century the realm was covered from Bornu, which lay on the banks of Lake Chad. Slavery was now very big business, and it has been estimated that something in the region of 2 million slaves passed north over the centuries. All this great trade had nothing at all to do with Europe. It was centred around Tripoli, the capital of the modern state of Libya. Writing of the situation on the route taken by the slave caravans across the Sahara, Martin Meredith, an expert in the history of this culture, had the following to say: wells along the way were surrounded by the skeletons of thousands of slaves, mostly young women and girls making a last desperate effort to reach water before dying of exhaustion once there. By this time, after the 15th century, the realms of Canaan and then Bornu were Muslim, the people there having embraced Islam as a result of coming into so much contact with Arabs in the course of the slave trade. This meant, of course, that they were compelled to go further afield than their own lands in search of slaves to sell, mindful of the prohibition laid down in the Hadith about enslaving Muslims. So they began raiding ever deeper into the forests of Central Africa and bringing back prisoners of war who could be sold to the Arabs or forced to work in the salt mines. The slave-based economy of Bornu lasted almost incredibly until the 19th century. If the British Empire was a wicked enterprise founded upon the trade in slaves, then so too were Mali and Canaan. They were wicked as well, and they should be condemned rather than lionised. On many websites devoted to black history, Mansa Musa features prominently. One such image may be seen in the thumbnail to this video. If Edward Colston's statue deserved to be pulled down in Bristol because of his links to the slave trade, then so too should we be removing images of Mansa Musa. He was even more culpable than Colston when it came to profiting from slavery. I give references in the description to this video for those who wish to follow my sources for what I've said here.